if I'm friends with God, I'm in the proper relationship. I found the theonomous. God is the nomos of my life.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. Our culture is obsessed with self-determination, finding our own voice, setting our own agenda, doing things according to our own lights. But is this problematic? And what does the Bible have to say about this path of self-determination? That's what we're discussing today, and we're discussing it with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a joy to be with you.
Couple of interesting conversations you've had lately. The first one is with a young man named Lex Friedman. Not sure if he's a household name for all of our listeners here, but he's a huge deal in the world of YouTube and podcasting. Tell us about him and how this discussion went.
Yeah, I love that conversation. Lex is a professor at MIT, and my nephew just graduated from MIT. And when we first got the invitation to be on his podcast, I called my nephew and said, hey, do you know this fellow? Oh, yeah, of course I do. And I watch his podcast all the time. That's how he came on my radar screen. And he does indeed talk to some of those interesting people in the world. And he's a very interesting fellow. Dresses very simply. He dresses like in a black coat, black tie, white shirt. Very earnest, not confrontational. He's the kind of person that wants to draw his interviewee out. Like, he might hear something you wrote, and could you say more about that? And so I remember, I don't know when this comes out, if the Friedman thing will have already been published, but the first thing he asked me was, well, who is God? So we kind of took it from there. But I enjoyed it immensely. It was about a 2-hour conversation.
Yeah, he specializes in these long-form interviews. I think almost all of them are 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes 4-hour long discussions.
We should talk about that sometime, because when all this got started, social media and all that, everything was, fast. No one's got an attention span. You can't get more than 5 minutes. When I was doing 8 and 9 minute videos, people were saying, "Oh, come on, you'll never keep people's attention." But then something happened in the zeitgeist, and someone like Joe Rogan comes to mind, Jordan Peterson, so many of the other ones begin doing these really long form conversations, and they get millions of views. So something shifted in the zeitgeist somewhere.
My theory is it's the podcast revolution. So podcasts took off. People now listen to podcasts when they're driving, when they're working out, when they're exercising, when they're mowing the lawn. And so people are using time that otherwise would have just been spent listening to music or thinking. And so they've got more time for it.
Yeah. I think it's all to the good.
Yeah. And anyway, I hope that video will be out by the time this episode airs. If it's not, it'll be coming soon. I think Lex told us it's coming out sometime in June. So we'll have more to say about that soon. The second interesting discussion you had was your continuing Bishop Barron Presents series. And in the latest instantiation, we had a couple appear. I think it was the first time you had 2 guests appear at the same time. They're a husband and a wife, Heather Hying and Brett Weinstein. Who are they, and what'd you guys talk about?
Yeah, fascinating couple. They came on the radar screen. They're evolutionary biologists from it was Evergreen State College in Washington. And about 5 years ago, there was this big kind of woke uprising because, as I understand it, all the white people were more or less told one day, you have to absent yourself from campus. And they objected to that. They thought it was a racist move. And their objection triggered this enormous counter-reaction. And they eventually left the college, but then took up a new role, really, as podcasters and became very insightful cultural commentators. And I think it was through Father Steve, he first started watching them, and he would say, oh, they're really interesting, and they had something really good to say today. So I started watching them a little bit and then read their book. And so we got them to come on Bishop Barron Presents, and we covered a lot of ground. Not so much the woke stuff, a little bit, but we got into religion science and how an evolutionary biologist understands human being and human motivation and what philosophy and religion adds to that. So that's really most of what we talked about. But that's out. That one's been out for a little while.
Yeah, that one's on YouTube. You can find it there. I'm also planning on sharing the audio of that discussion as the next episode in the Word on Fire show series. So you can listen to it in many different formats. Good. Okay, let's turn now to self-determination. In a recent article you wrote, you noted our culture's fascination with determining our own self, finding our voice, setting our agenda, determining who we are. Have you noticed a rise in this over the last, say, 5, 10, 15 years? And if so, what explains this obsession?
Well, it's an age-old issue. It's been around for a long time, obviously, the drive toward autonomy. But yes, to answer your question, I think in recent years, there's been an extreme expression of it. Look at the movies. Listen to almost every song. Almost every story told in the popular culture ends up with someone shaking off, the oppressive influence of a tradition or someone telling me what to do, and I find my own voice. So yeah, I think that's almost the dominant motif in the culture, especially among young people. It's always been attractive, autonomy. Sure, it's my life, it's my decisions, and so on. But it's a dead end when it's one-sidedly emphasized, and that's what we'll talk about. We have to make some key distinctions there. What differentiates autonomy from the authentic self-appropriation? But yeah, I think for sure there's been a revival of it in our time.
Before we get into a more critical assessment of self-determination, what are the positive aspects? It's not all bad, right? Why is it attractive? Why is it somewhat good?
Well, let me make this distinction early on here. I think will help guide the conversation between autonomy on the one hand, heteronomy on the other hand, and what I'd call theonomy, which is somewhere in the middle. Autonomy, autos nomos, I'm my own law. Good, yeah, as far as it goes, because it's part of maturity. When I can shake off a purely heteronymous, so another person is my law, heteros nomos, as an other, my parents or my society or my culture. There is something about coming to maturity and coming of age when you say, no, I'm going to shake off just that purely heteronymous influence, and I'm going to say, no, this is my life on my terms. This is who I am. I'm going to live my own life. Yeah, that's a good thing. If we were to stay forever in a purely heteronymous position, well, we'd be like children then. Think of a little tiny kid who really has no thoughts or motivations or convictions of his own, but takes them all from the outside. Appropriate when you're a little tiny child. But you know this, Brandon, with all your kids, is that part of good parenting is to recognize the seeds of a sort of burgeoning autonomy and not to just crush them. No, to do what you're told. No, stay there. Even if the child is going off on a somewhat errant path, there's still something right about burgeoning autonomy. Like, okay, he or she is finding, himself. The trouble is the oscillation between the two, and that happens a lot, is I'm so strong on autonomy. It's my life, it's my will, it's my way. That leads to trouble. And then I can sometimes react from that and go all the way to heteronomy. I turn my life completely over to parents or culture or pop stars or whatever it is. That's got its own negativity. Where we're trying to go is theonomy, which is God becomes the nomos of my life. God becomes the governor of my life. And that actually affirms what's best in both autonomy and heteronomy.
Do you think that this increase in the culture of self-determination, autonomy, call it what we will, that there's something uniquely American about it? So in our country, is this something programmed into our national DNA?
Yeah, I think so, because look, the people that came over to this country were almost exclusively shaking off the shackles and fetters of the old culture. The people that came here were not the aristocrats who were doing very well in Europe. They were the downtrodden and the persecuted and the forgotten and the poor who were being oppressed by, let's face it, some very unjust social and cultural structures. And so, yes, indeed, freedom, don't tread on me, don't tell me what to do, don't tax me without my representation. I mean, all of that, as you say, is very deep in the American DNA. And as far as it goes, good. My ancestors came over here from Ireland because of the oppressiveness of a British society that was effectively committing genocide against the Irish. So I get that. And Irish have a kind of natural, don't tell me what to do, like the fighting Irish. I get that. That's in my blood too. So as an Irishman, as an American, I get all that. I don't want some heteronymous imposition of an oppressive political or economic or cultural system. So yeah, I think that is deep in our DNA.
Well, let's move maybe to a more critical analysis. And in the article that you wrote on this topic, you approached it from a biblical perspective, especially, and specifically the end of the book of Judges in the Old Testament, not a book that gets a lot of attention usually. Maybe first let's start with that. What is the book of Judges? What's it about?
Well, let's go back one step, Brandon, before we get to Judges, is look at Exodus, because look how the book of Exodus, talk about throwing off oppressive heteronomy. It's about a people who are enslaved by a deeply corrupt political and religious culture. And they throw off their chains, they escape from that heteronomy, but what's interesting, where do they go? They don't simply wander on their own steam into the desert. Rather, they go to the sacred mountain where they receive what? A law. So, yes, they've escaped from oppressive heteronomy, but they haven't lurched toward sheer autonomy. What they've gone to, in fact, is what I just called theonomy, where God and God's law becomes the governing principle of their lives. Yes, indeed, that's everything great about autonomy is contained in that story, but it's not a one-sided affirmation of autonomy. It's a journey from heteronomy to theonomy, I would say. So that becomes the master metaphor, if you want, for the whole Bible. How do you find real freedom? Not by just asserting your autonomy over and against the autonomy of the Egyptians. Then it's just one more meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right? As the Who put it. But you're trying to escape from an oppressive heteronomy into authentic theonomy. Now, the book of Judges. I said that the book of Judges is maybe the most brutal book in the Bible, and that's saying a lot because the Bible is remarkably frank about human beings and about what we do and what we get wrong. And mind you, Judges comes right after the book of Joshua, and the book of Joshua is pretty intense itself. I mean, with this kind of blitzkrieging invasion of Israel into the Promised Land. And so it's a very, very frank assessment of what we human beings are like, I would say, when our autonomy one-sidedly and massively asserts itself. Judges, that certain figures were called upon by God to judge and to rule and to guide the people. The rhythm of the book of Judges is always the same. It's Israel becomes lost. There's no direction. Everyone drifts into dysfunction. It gets so terrible that it becomes just a crisis, and then God raises up a judge. There are, I think, 12 mentioned in the book, 4 are highlighted. And then they bring some kind of stability, some kind of order, but it doesn't last long, and soon they devolve again into autonomous disaster, and then another judge is raised up. So I would say it's a very frank assessment of what we human beings are like as we try to live our lives. Autonomy, that's really going back to Egypt. See, that's the point. If I'm just saying, hey, it's my life, it's my will, it's my way, I'm no better really than the Egyptians. The key is escaping from that kind of heteronomy, but not into autonomy, rather into theonomy.
The book of Judges has several of these violent, gory, unjust situations. I don't want to go into all the particulars, but needless to say, everything you could imagine, disregard from human dignity, sexual immorality, rape, cooperation with sexual abuse, all of it's in there. But then we find at the end of the book of Judges, after these moral leaders, these judges have faded away, the law is no longer taught, no longer enforced, and hence the people wander into this appalling behavior. The final line, though, of the book, the last line of the book of Judges, is the one I want to spend a little time on with you because it gets right to the heart of this spiritual situation. Here's what it says. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own sight. What's the Bible trying to convey with this line?
It's trying to convey that what we got today, which is a hyper stress on autonomy, is not the path forward. See, kingship. Is the Bible very aware of the corruption of kingship? Yes. In fact, more than almost any other ancient text that I know, the Bible is aware of how kings go bad. So it's not guilty of some kind of one-sided valorization of kings. On the other hand, is the king something good? Yes, in the measure that the king represents the divine authority. If the king is the embodiment of God's law, he's operating according to God's purpose, then he's providing the guidance the people need. if you throw off all kings, you throw off all the judges, and everyone does whatever he or she wants to do, you're right back into the chaos of self-government, self-governance. And I think when Judges ends as it does on this incomparably brutal note, there's a story that's told about this man getting this concubine, and then she's exposed to rape all night long. Eventually she dies. She's dismembered, and the parts of her body are sent as a warning to other parts of the country. Talk about Scorsese, or talk about Quentin Tarantino. By the way, when people sometimes will criticize me for like reviewing a Tarantino movie or a Scorsese movie and finding some themes in it that are worth thinking about, how could you, Bishop? How could you watch such movies? I always say, have you read the Bible recently? I mean, if you were to film the book of Judges just as it is, you're going beyond Tarantino. You're going beyond Scorsese. But that's the great brutal honesty of the Bible when it comes to what goes wrong with us. Getting rid of the divine king, that ain't the answer. Oppressive human kings, sure, like Pharaoh, overcoming that kind of heteronomy, sure. But the answer is not a lurch to autonomy, it's a surrender to theonomy. God becomes the nomos, God becomes the law and norm of my life.
You've noted that elsewhere in the Bible, outside the book of Judges, the heroes of the Bible are rarely those who find themselves on their own, but rather those who listen to the voice of God and then remain obedient to the mission that God has given them. Can you maybe share some of those examples of those heroes?
Well, it's every single one. And it's so important, isn't it, Brandon? Because as I say, today, look at every story, every movie, every song. They're all about someone who finds himself. And now I can walk my own path, and now I'm truly free. Well, the Bible is just not interested in that. The Bible is interested. Now, this is whether you're talking about Abraham, about Jacob, about Joseph, about Moses, about Isaiah, about Jeremiah, about David. I mean, every one of the great heroes of the Bible isn't finding himself. And boy, now I know what I'm supposed to do. They're all people who come to listen, to hear. It begins with Abram, right? Becomes Abraham, the father of many nations. He hears the voice of the Lord. He hears a higher voice. Not, mind you, not the voice of the cultures around him, not his own voice, but rather a qualitatively different voice, which is the voice of God. And when he surrenders to that, he finds his authentic self. Would anyone ever say that Abraham in the Bible, well, he's just some little mealy-mouthed, wussy person that is just, being bossed around? No, he's a fully realized personality, full of intelligence and courage and purpose. But he finds that precisely in his surrender to God. David at his best. Now, see, David falls into autonomy, doesn't he? The Bathsheba incident and Uriah and so on. He falls into that. But David at his best, who listens to the Lord, who abides by the Lord's command. Would anyone ever say David is some kind of, wimpy, put-upon figure? No, David is courageous and full of a distinctive, personality and all that. He's most himself when he surrenders to God's purpose. Now, that's the Bible. That's the Bible. Stop the oscillating between autonomy and heteronomy. That's the story of most of us. We oscillate between them. Find theonomy, which is beyond and inclusive of, if you want, the best of both of them. Because, see, in a way, God's law is beyond me. That's true. It's heteros, if you want. It's other. But it's not other in a conventional way. It's other in such a way that it affirms me and brings out the very best in me, right? That's the Bible. But that's a tricky place to find. That's a tricky spiritual space to move into. I surrender, Lord, to you utterly. And now it's you who have accomplished all that I have done. That's Isaiah, the prophet, right? I've done it. Yes, my life and my accomplishments, but Lord, it's you who've accomplished them through me. That's the biblical imagination. And that's a tricky space to find.
It seems to me a lot of the problem we have with escaping autonomy and moving into theonomy is a lot of us are still stuck in this zero-sum game that we're jostling with God. It's the whole non-competitive transcendence doctrine that you've been teaching
Right.
for years. And so we feel as if we don't get that Isaiah adage in our heart that you have done all that we've done. It's either I do it or God does it. Either
Right.
God directs it or I direct it. And we're not comfortable with this space where we're both together on this mission.
Well, and may I say, Brandon, going back to earlier conversations we've had about the Protestant-Catholic difference, is I do think as I read the great Protestant reformers, there was this temptation on their part to fall precisely into that problem. So for God to get all the glory, I've got to get no glory. So if it's God is responsible utterly, I'm justified by grace through faith. I have no credit, no merit comes to me. I don't. It's not my accomplishment in any way. It's all God. But as you say, the trouble there is that we're imagining our will and the divine will in a zero-sum sort of competition. When in fact, as I often cite from St. Irenaeus, the glory of God, to God all the glory, is what? A human being fully alive. So God doesn't need to put me down to be glorified. On the contrary, he's glorified the more I'm elevated by his grace. That is I learned that principle years ago, and I think it's a hinge upon which so much of Christian doctrine properly turns.
Let's close with this. You observed that our world might not be exactly as bad as what we read in the book of Judges yet.
Thank God.
Yeah, thank God. But the biblical author does seem to suggest at the end with that haunting final line, this is the direction you're going in when people start doing what's right in their own eyes. Do you feel like we're heading down that path today? And if so, how do we avoid it and get back on track?
Yeah, we're always heading down, I suppose, Brandon, in a way. It's built into the sinful human condition. That's where we tend to go, is down that path. I think it's intriguing in the Bible. So you have Joshua judges Ruth, and Ruth is a little bit of an interruption of the narrative. But what comes right after that is 1 Samuel. And what's 1 Samuel now? That's the story of Samuel, who chooses Saul as king, and then when he fails, anoints David as king. The paradigmatic king of the Old Testament. Followed by lots of failures, I get that, lots of failed kings. But David is the paradigmatic king who looks forward to the son of David, the definitive king who's Christ. Now here's my point. Judges ends with, there was no king, there was no direction whatsoever. So what does God do? God's going to raise up a king whose job is to provide moral and spiritual direction. Now David, he's a failed figure too. We know that. So David looks forward to his definitive son, the son of David, whom we know as the Mashiach, the anointed one, the definitive David figure. Christ becomes the new law. I love how Thomas Aquinas speaks of the Eucharist as the taking into ourselves of the new law. Isn't that marvelous? See, Christ himself is the nomos. So when I eat and drink his body and blood, I'm taking into myself the law. Now, what did Jeremiah say? Is the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. I will write the law not on stone, but in their hearts. Well, when did that happen? It happened on the Last Supper, when Jesus said, here, this is my body, this is my blood, eat and drink. Take my nomos, my law, into your very body, so that now you're under my aegis. And now I no longer call you servants, right? That's heteronomy. I'm the master, you're the slave. I don't call you that. I call you friends. Well, friends are, if I'm friends with God, I'm in the proper relationship. I found the theonomos. God is the nomos of my life. That's how I draw from Judges through the story of David all the way to Christ, and then through Christ to the Eucharist. I think there's a golden thread that runs through all that.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you have something that you'd like to ask Bishop Barron, send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today we have a question from a good man named Charlie Brown, a great name. He's a Word on Fire Institute member from London, and he's got a good question for Bishop.
Good.
Here it is.
Hi, Bishop Barron. Charlie Brown here from London, England. With the return of baseball, yay, thanks be to God, my question is, as a fan myself who absolutely loves the game, but which, as you know, can easily take up a lot of time, focus, and even study, how do we properly balance a passion like that with the one necessary thing upon which we're all called to focus our entire lives? Now, obviously, being a Word on Fire Institute member is a great help, but any other advice would be much appreciated. Thank you, and dare I say it, go Mariners!
Go Mariners. So you're from London, but you're for the Seattle Mariners. Unless there's a Mariners team in London, I'm missing. But no, thanks for that. And fellow baseball fan, there's no competition. In other words, like something like baseball, which you're right, is very contemplative. It might take you, hours and hours to watch a game. If you're doing it properly, you are really into it. Just like, playing golf, which I love, a round of golf will take 4 or 5 hours, and it requires a lot of concentration. But that's not in competition with our love of God. In fact, those are kind of modes of contemplation. They're modes of entering into something of God's creation and finding the beauty and truth and goodness in it. It's like contemplating in that way a work of art or contemplating a great cathedral. It doesn't have to be explicitly religious, but whenever I notice something good, true, or beautiful, I'm participating in something of God's being. So no, I don't see any competition there. Obviously, if you become an obsessive, all you're doing is watching baseball games. But if you see that opportunity as a contemplative opportunity, and I love that about baseball. You're right that it's not like just a whiz bang. It's you got to really think and spend time and muse over the game and think about it rather deeply. But those are beautiful moments if we approach them in kind of a contemplative spirit.
Well, thanks, Charlie, for your question. Thanks to everybody for joining us for this episode. It's been a couple months since we've released a new book here at Word on Fire, but we do have a new one. It is titled The New Apologetics, Defending the Faith in a Post-Christian Era. This book was edited by Matt Nelson from our Word on Fire Institute, but it features contributions from over 40 different writers. And I don't want to tick through the names at the risk of not getting through all of them, but it's a who's who of the brightest apologists and evangelists and philosophers and theologians across the English-speaking world. What the book is doing is charting the next stage, the next phase, the next path for apologetics in the 21st century. We look at new audiences that we're trying to reach, new approaches, new topics, new issues. So it's a delight. I encourage you to learn more about this new book. It features an introduction by Cardinal Collins from Toronto, and then an afterword by our own Bishop Barron. I'll include a link to the book in the show notes for this episode. Well, thank you so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.